I knew something was off the moment I saw the black SUV circling my driveway, slow, deliberate, like they were sizing me up. Minutes later, 3 uniformed security guards stepped out, radios crackling, eyes fixed on my house. The HOA had finally decided to deal with me. The irony? Every single one of those men had once sat in my training sessions. I'd taught them everything they knew. How to stay calm, how to assess threats, how to take orders. But that day, they weren't taking mine. What happens when the student is sent to confront the teacher? Before everything spiraled out of control, my life in Oak Ridge Estates was quiet, predictable in the best way. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns look like magazine covers, mailboxes matched by color code, and everyone waved just long enough to look polite. It was the kind of place you move to when you think you're finally done with chaos, when you've earned a little peace. For years, I'd had that peace. My mornings started with coffee on the porch, watching the same group of joggers circle the cul-de-sac. My afternoons were for fixing things in the garage, a habit I'd carried over from my years in law enforcement. I was retired now, at least officially, though retirement never really sticks for someone who's lived by schedules and structure their whole life. The neighbors knew me as the quiet guy who kept to himself, the one who helped people jump their car batteries and waved at kids riding their bikes too close to the curb. I liked it that way. I'd done my years of dealing with tension, command and control. I wanted none of it here. Oak Ridge was supposed to be simple. But HOAs have a way of turning simple into systematic. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the board. Their letters were routine. Reminders about recycling bins left out too long, notices about hedges growing a few inches over regulation height. I followed the rules, more or less. Everyone did. That's how the neighborhood stayed neat, how property values stayed high. Still, something about the new board felt different. They weren't content with order. They wanted obedience. A new president had been elected, a man named Ronald Pierce, a corporate type, sharp suits, always smiling a little too wide. He'd moved in a year earlier and immediately started reforming the HOA. It began with new signage, then mandatory landscaping reviews, and finally the security patrols. Oak Ridge never needed security before. We didn't have crime. We had crows that knocked over trash cans and teenagers who played loud music at night. But Pierce said it was about community safety. He convinced everyone that visibility was deterrence. So now, twice a day, uniformed guards drove through the neighborhood in shiny black SUVs. To most people, it was reassuring. To me, it felt staged, like a performance meant to remind everyone who was in charge. The first time I noticed them slowing near my house, I brushed it off. Maybe they were checking a GPS. The second time, they parked across the street for 10 minutes. I felt their eyes behind the tinted glass. And the third time, they took photos. That's when I realized something had shifted. See, I used to train private security teams, the same kind of company the HOA had now hired. I'd spent decades teaching men how to de-escalate, how to act within legal boundaries, how to recognize authority. I knew their posture, their formation, the way they held their radios, just so. Watching them from my porch felt like watching my own lessons turned against me. The letters started coming again, not about my lawn, not about the trash bins. This time it was about non-compliance. No details, just warnings. Then a notice for a hearing. Apparently, my property did not meet community standards. I laughed when I read it. My grass was trimmed, my house freshly painted. There was nothing to dispute. But this wasn't about grass. It was about control.
Pierce wanted to make a point. He'd seen me question a few of his new policies during an open HOA meeting. Nothing dramatic, just a few words about overreach and budget misuse. I didn't think it mattered, but people remembered. Some even nodded along. That, to Pierce, was enough reason to make me an example. So the letters kept coming. Then came the security patrols. And then came the incident that changed everything. The morning I walked outside to find 3 uniformed guards waiting by my driveway, hands on radios, eyes locked on me. That's where the story you're about to hear begins. With the HOA that wanted control, the security team sent to enforce it, and the one man they should have known better than to confront. Because I wasn't just another homeowner ignoring a rule book. I was the one who taught theirs. The day those guards stood at the edge of my driveway, the air felt heavier, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. They didn't say a word at first. They didn't have to. Their presence was enough. 3 men in black uniforms, radios crackling faintly, standing shoulder to shoulder like a wall. Their SUV idled behind them, engine rumbling, HOA logo freshly printed on the side doors. I watched from my porch, coffee still in hand. I could tell right away who was in charge, the one in the middle. His stance was solid, but nervous. The kind of nervous that comes when you know you're on the edge of doing something wrong, but you're being paid to do it anyway. He finally spoke. His voice carried the tone of authority, but not the experience of it. "Sir, we've received complaints from the HOA regarding non-compliance. We need to take some pictures of the property for documentation." I nodded slowly. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Who trained you?" His face changed. The guard beside him shifted, uncomfortable. I recognized the hesitation immediately, recognition flickering behind his eyes. One of them had been in my certification class 2 years prior. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I let them take their pictures. No confrontation, no shouting. But as they left, the one I recognized glanced back once, almost apologetically. That told me everything. This wasn't about compliance. This was about sending a message. The next week, the letters doubled. Violation notice, community disturbance complaint, failure to adhere to HOA landscaping standards. Each one was vague, no evidence, just warnings, and each one came with a new fine, $250 here, $500 there. It was death by paperwork, a slow bleed designed to wear me down. I called the HOA office. No one answered. I emailed, no reply. When I finally got through to someone, a young woman who sounded more nervous than informed, she said the board had escalated my file to a disciplinary committee. I asked what that meant. She just said, "They'll contact you soon." The very next morning, they did. 3 board members showed up at my door, led, of course, by Ronald Pierce. He stood on my porch like he owned it, flanked by 2 others holding clipboards. Pierce smiled the way people do when they've already decided you're guilty. "Just a friendly visit," he said. "We've received multiple reports about your property. We need to ensure it meets our standards." I let them look around. They couldn't find a thing wrong. Not one overgrown bush, not one misplaced trash bin. When I pointed that out, Pierce's smile tightened. He looked me in the eye and said, "You know, compliance isn't just about what's visible. It's about cooperation." That word, cooperation, stuck with me. It wasn't about rules. It was about obedience. 2 days later, I got another letter. "Due to continued non-compliance and hostility toward the board, your privileges to community facilities are suspended pending further review." I hadn't used the community pool in years, but that wasn't the point. It was about control, 1 inch at a time. By the 3rd week, the security patrols became more frequent. Morning, afternoon, night. Sometimes they parked across the street for 20 minutes, doing nothing, just watching. The neighbors started to whisper. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked at me like I was radioactive. I could feel the isolation setting in. That's how HOAs win. Not through force, but through exhaustion. They grind you down until you stop fighting. But I wasn't built to stop. I started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, even security footage from my own cameras. I printed every letter, saved every email. And then I went deeper. I pulled public records on Oak Ridge HOA, budgets, contracts, vendor lists. That's when I found it. Pierce had signed a contract with the private security company 3 weeks before the board voted to approve it. And guess whose signature was missing from the approval page? The treasurer's. That meant the contract wasn't legally binding, which meant those guards technically had no authority to patrol at all. That discovery was my first weapon. The following Friday, they made their next move. A certified letter arrived, final notice before legal action. It claimed I owed over $3,200 in accumulated fines, and that the HOA intended to place a lien on my property if I didn't comply within 10 days. That's when I realized Pierce was done playing subtle. He wanted to make an example out of me. I drove to the HOA office that afternoon. The receptionist looked startled when I walked in, maybe because most people never confront the board face-to-face. I asked to speak with Pierce. She hesitated, then led me down the hallway to the meeting room. He was there, sitting behind a polished wooden table surrounded by binders labeled Rules Enforcement and Budget Amendments. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply laid the contract copy on the table and said, "This is void. You hired security before board approval. That means your patrols are unauthorized." For the first time, Pierce's smile faltered, only for a second, but I caught it. Then he leaned back and said, "We'll have our lawyers handle it." I left without another word. But the next day, things escalated further. At 9:14 p.m., I heard engines outside, 2 SUVs, the same guards, but this time with flashlights. They stood on my driveway again, taking pictures of my home in the dark. I stepped out calmly, phone recording in my pocket. "Evening, gentlemen. Still working overtime for a contract that doesn't exist?" They froze. One of them, the same guard from before, quietly lowered his flashlight. The leader mumbled something about orders from the HOA. I reminded them that trespassing on private property without a legal mandate could end badly. Not for me, for them. They hesitated, exchanged glances, and backed away. The SUV door slammed, and they drove off into the night. I thought that might be the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to my door. Notice of violation. Aggressive conduct toward HOA representatives. I actually laughed. They were rewriting reality now. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't just a homeowner with a file of complaints. I still had connections, real ones, former officers, lawyers, even a few friends in the Department of Consumer Affairs. So I made a call. Within a week, an investigator reached out, not to me, but to the HOA. A formal inquiry had been opened regarding misuse of funds and improper enforcement actions. And suddenly the tone of everything changed. The letters stopped, the patrols slowed. The neighbors started looking nervous again, not at me this time, but at Pierce. Rumors spread fast in a quiet neighborhood. Some said Pierce had been using HOA funds for consulting expenses. Others said the board was under review. I didn't confirm or deny anything, I just waited. Then, one morning, a different SUV pulled up to my house, this time a government vehicle. The investigator stepped out, clipboard in hand. He asked if I'd be willing to provide documentation. I handed him everything, every photo, every email, every timestamp. He thanked me and left without another word. That was the moment I knew the tide had turned. But power doesn't go quietly. The next HOA meeting was packed, the largest turnout I'd ever seen. People who hadn't attended in years filled the folding chairs, whispering to each other as the board members took their seats. Pierce tried to open with his usual polished speech, but his voice trembled slightly. Then, the investigator walked in. Clipboard, badge. Silence filled the room. He didn't even need to say much, just a few simple words. "We've received credible complaints regarding unauthorized spending and procedural violations within this board." Gasps rippled through the room.
Pierce's face went pale. That's where the meeting ended, abruptly. Over the next few days, security patrols vanished. The black SUVs stopped circling. The board went silent, and then came the notice, official and brief. Ronald Pierce has resigned as HOA president, effective immediately due to personal reasons. The rest of the board followed quietly over the next month. It should have felt like victory, but standing there, looking at my quiet street again, it just felt heavy. Because I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about every homeowner who's ever been pushed around by a system built to protect them, but twisted by people who crave control. Still, the quiet was back. The peace I'd wanted from the start. Only this time, it was earned. And yet, one question still lingered in my mind. One that still keeps me up sometimes. What happens when the people who are supposed to protect your peace become the ones who threaten it? By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the tension in Oak Ridge Estates could be felt in the air. Thick, humming, almost electric. The notice had gone out a week earlier. Emergency board meeting, mandatory attendance requested. That alone was unusual. HOA meetings were rarely mandatory, but this one, everyone knew something was about to explode. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go. Part of me wanted to stay home, sit on my porch and let the board collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. But another part of me, the part that had spent decades teaching others about accountability, knew I needed to be there. Not for revenge, for truth. So that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rows of manicured houses, I walked toward the community center. From the street, it looked like a courtroom dressed as a conference hall. White walls, shiny floors, and a banner that read, Oak Ridge Estates, building a better community together. Inside, every chair was filled. The buzz of whispers filled the air like static. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in months were suddenly united by curiosity and tension. At the front sat the board, Pierce in the center, flanked by the remaining members. He looked calm on the surface, but I could see the strain in the way his jaw tightened and loosened. On the table before him sat stacks of papers, a gavel, and a single folder marked Confidential. I took a seat near the back. The same investigator from before was there, sitting quietly in the corner, clipboard resting on his lap. His presence alone told me this meeting wasn't going to end with polite words. Pierce cleared his throat and began. Thank you everyone for attending tonight's emergency session. There have been rumors, misinformation really, circulating about the board's actions. I want to address those directly. His tone was steady, but his hands fidgeted slightly with the papers. He went on for several minutes, deflecting, minimizing, trying to rebuild the image he'd lost. He called the investigation a misunderstanding. He said the security patrols were for everyone's safety. He claimed that the HOA had acted in good faith.
The crowd shifted uneasily. I could hear small murmurs ripple through the room. Then Pierce said it, the sentence that flipped the room from uneasy silence to boiling disbelief. And regarding the false allegations about unauthorized spending, our financial records are perfectly clear. Every expense was approved and documented properly. That's when I stood up. All eyes turned toward me. My voice didn't need to be loud, just clear. Then you won't mind showing the residents those records, will you? Pierce froze.
I walked forward slowly, holding a thick folder in my hand. Because, Mr. Pierce, I have the original contract between Oak Ridge Estates and Sentinel Security. You signed it 3 weeks before the board voted on it, which means every dollar spent after that signature came out of the community budget, illegally. A murmur of shock spread through the room. Someone gasped. Someone else said, "Is that true?" Pierce's face drained of color. He tried to speak, but the words came out choked. "You're misinformed. That contract was pre-approved pending nothing. The treasurer's signature is missing, and according to HOA bylaws, Section 4.3, subsection C, any contract without full board approval is void, meaning you hired unlicensed security to harass residents with our money." The room erupted, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, whispers turning into outrage. Pierce slammed the gavel, demanding order, but no one was listening anymore. The investigator rose from his chair, calm but deliberate. "Mr. Pierce, we have verified the documentation. The board's actions are under active review. At this point, I advise you to refrain from making further statements." For a moment, everything went still. The only sound was the faint buzz of the ceiling lights. Then, slowly, Pierce sat back down, his confidence crumbling like plaster. He muttered something under his breath, but the microphone caught it. "This is a setup." That single sentence turned the crowd again, not against me, but against him. People began shouting questions. "What setup? Where did the money go? You said the security was for safety." I didn't need to say another word. The truth was out, and once truth catches fire, it spreads faster than any lie. The investigator stepped forward, gathered the papers from the table, and signaled to a uniformed officer waiting near the door, a county sheriff, there to ensure order. The irony wasn't lost on me. Pierce's voice cracked as he tried to protest. "You can't just... This is harassment. I was acting for the good of the community." The officer didn't respond. He just asked him to stand. When Pierce finally did, his face was red, his tie loosened, his composure gone. He walked past the rows of neighbors who once greeted him with polite smiles. No one smiled now. They just watched, silent, cold, almost stunned. And then he was gone. The door shut behind him, and the silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the tension of fear, it was the exhale after months of being held hostage by authority. Someone finally spoke. "So what happens now?" The investigator turned toward the room. "There will be a re-election. An interim committee will handle finances and correspondence until then. Residents will receive full transparency reports within 30 days. It was over. Or at least that's what everyone thought. That night, I walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, maybe for the first time in months. But peace has a strange way of feeling temporary, especially when you've seen what people will do for power. When I reached my driveway, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A single sheet of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. No envelope, no signature, just one printed sentence. "This isn't over." I stared at it for a long time, the night air cold against my skin. For a moment, the old instincts kicked in, the part of me trained to read threats, to assess risks, to prepare for what might come next. But then I realized something important. This wasn't fear. It was closure disguised as defiance. Because when someone who's built their power on intimidation has nothing left, threats are all they have left to give. I folded the paper once, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and walked inside.
My house was quiet, peaceful. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, the kind that feels earned. For months, Pierce had tried to control the narrative, to make me the problem, the rule breaker, the outsider. But now, everyone knew the truth. The system that was meant to protect order had been weaponized. And for once, the person pulling the strings was finally caught in his own web. Still, as I stood by the window, watching the empty street, a thought lingered. How many other neighborhoods were living this same story? How many people were being silenced, fined, and harassed, all under the banner of community? That's the thing about control. It never starts loud. It starts small, with a letter, a rule, a warning. And before you know it, you're standing on your own porch, staring down the people you once trusted. The same people who claimed to protect you. The next morning, news spread fast. Word traveled through emails, text chains, even local news. Oak Ridge HOA president resigns amid misconduct investigation. Neighbors who once avoided me now waved again. Some even thanked me quietly as I walked by. But it wasn't gratitude I wanted. It was accountability. And as I watched the same black SUVs get towed away for good, I finally felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not relief, not pride, just peace. Peace, because sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about reminding the people in power that someone's still watching. And when they finally realize that, that's when real change begins. In the weeks after the meeting, Oak Ridge Estates didn't look much different from the outside. The lawns were still trimmed to perfection, the mailboxes still matched, the same kids rode their bikes down the same quiet streets. But if you looked closely, really looked, you could feel that something beneath the surface had shifted. The silence wasn't as heavy anymore. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear or control. It was the quiet that comes after a long storm, when the rain has finally stopped, but the air is still thick with what it's washed away. Ronald Pierce was gone. Officially, resigned for personal reasons. The board announced it through a 2-sentence email that avoided any mention of investigations, audits, or disciplinary actions. The rest of the board members followed, one by one, until the HOA was down to an interim committee, neighbors who'd volunteered just to keep the lights on and the paperwork moving. The security company contract was terminated within a week. The black SUVs disappeared from our streets, leaving only faint tire marks on the asphalt. A reminder of how close our neighborhood had come to turning into something it was never meant to be. The investigator's report came out quietly, tucked away in an email attachment that few people probably read in full. It confirmed everything: unauthorized spending, procedural violations, misuse of funds, and multiple breaches of HOA bylaws. Ronald Pierce would be barred from serving on any homeowner association board in the county again. That should have felt like victory, but victory didn't feel like what I thought it would. The first few days after everything ended were strange. Neighbors who used to avoid me now went out of their way to wave, smile, or stop for small talk. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner, for staying out of it, for believing the board's version of events. I told them there was nothing to apologize for, but deep down, I knew there was. Because that's how power like this grows, not through the loudest voices, but through the quietest silences. A few neighbors even dropped by with home-baked bread or coffee as peace offerings. I accepted, mostly out of politeness, though a part of me couldn't shake the thought. Would any of this have happened if I wasn't who I am? If I didn't know the rules? If I didn't know how to read contracts? How to recognize abuse of authority? How to fight back without fear? What happens to the people who can't? A month later, I was invited to the first open forum for electing a new HOA board. It was the first time the residents had been given a true say in who would lead them. The meeting was packed, just like the last one, but the energy was different now. People asked questions, real questions. They demanded transparency, financial oversight, accountability. They weren't afraid to speak. I sat in the back of the room, quietly listening. I didn't plan to run for anything. I'd had enough of authority for a lifetime. But watching others find their voice was its own kind of reward. The new board that formed was smaller, simpler, and humbler. No more grand speeches about community values or efficiency through enforcement. Just a few neighbors trying to fix what had been broken. And, maybe that was enough.
Over time, things slowly returned to normal. The tension that used to hang in the air faded, replaced by a cautious kind of peace. But some scars stayed, not visible, but present in the way people spoke, the way they glanced at notices pinned to bulletin boards, the way they read every email twice. For months, Pierce's name still came up in whispers. Some said he'd moved to another town. Others said he was trying to start over in another HOA, under a different name. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. All I knew was that men like him didn't disappear. They just found new neighborhoods. One evening, I was out trimming the hedges when a car I didn't recognize slowed in front of my house. For a split second, that old instinct returned. The flash of suspicion, the readiness for confrontation. But then I saw who it was. One of the security guards from before. He parked and got out, hands in his pockets. His uniform was gone, civilian clothes now. "Hey," he said, hesitating like he wasn't sure I'd remember him, but I did. He was the one who'd looked back that first day, the one who'd hesitated before taking pictures of my property. He thanked me, said after that night he'd quit the company, said it didn't sit right with him, being told to intimidate people for money. He'd taken a different job, one that didn't involve following orders blindly. I told him I was proud of that. He smiled, nodded, and drove off. That was the moment I realized something deeper. Maybe justice isn't always about punishment. Maybe sometimes it's about awakening. By the end of the year, Oak Ridge Estates had a new reputation, not as the perfect, polished neighborhood it once claimed to be, but as the one that stood up. Other communities started reaching out, asking how we handled it, how we exposed it, how we took back control. It became something larger than I ever meant it to be, a quiet reminder that even small neighborhoods can be microcosms of power, greed, and resistance. But it also taught me something about myself. For years, after leaving law enforcement, I'd told myself I was done with conflict, that I'd earned peace, that the world could turn without me needing to intervene. But the truth is, peace isn't something you own. It's something you maintain, actively, constantly. Because the moment you stop paying attention, someone else will try to claim it for you. Months later, I stood at the community entrance, where the old Security Patrol in Progress sign used to hang. In its place was a new one, simple and unassuming. Oak Ridge Estates, a community by its residents. I smiled when I saw it, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. No system, no structure, no rulebook can guarantee fairness. Only people can. People willing to question, to stand up, to say no when yes feels easier. The HOA will always exist in one form or another. New faces, new rules, new temptations. That's just how communities work. But at least here, people know better. They know how quickly order can turn into oppression. They know how silence becomes complicity. And they know that one person, even just one, can shift the balance back toward justice. Every now and then, I still get a letter from the HOA. Nothing sinister anymore, just the usual seasonal updates, landscaping reminders, holiday announcements. And every time I see the envelope, a small part of me tenses, the old reflex that doesn't fade easily. But then I open it, read it, and realize it's harmless. Still, I keep every single one. Not out of paranoia, out of principle. Because memory is a kind of armor. And forgetting, that's how it all starts again. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I sit on my porch and think about how close we came to losing everything that made this place worth living in. Not the houses, or the lawns, or the mailboxes, but the trust. The sense that your home is your space,
not something to be dictated by someone else's idea of perfection. That's what Pierce never understood. You can control rules, you can control money, but you can't control the human need for dignity. That's what undid him in the end. Not paperwork, not legalities, just people. Ordinary, tired, frustrated people who decided they'd had enough. And when people like that stand together, even quietly, there's nothing more powerful. So no, the story didn't end with fireworks or some dramatic courtroom showdown. It ended with slow change, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but lasts longer. Pierce got his punishment. The HOA restructured. The neighborhood found its balance again. And me, I got my peace. Not the kind that comes from quiet streets and trimmed lawns. The kind that comes from knowing that this time, when power came knocking, I didn't look away.
Over time, things slowly returned to normal. The tension that used to hang in the air faded, replaced by a cautious kind of peace. But some scars stayed. Not visible, but present in the way people spoke, the way they glanced at notices pinned to bulletin boards, the way they read every email twice. For months, Pierce's name still came up in whispers. Some said he'd moved to another town. Others said he was trying to start over in another HOA under a different name. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. All I knew was that men like him didn't disappear. They just found new neighborhoods. One evening, I was out trimming the hedges when a car I didn't recognize slowed in front of my house. For a split second, that old instinct returned, the flash of suspicion, the readiness for confrontation. But then I saw who it was, one of the security guards from before. He parked and got out, hands in his pockets. His uniform was gone, civilian clothes now. "Hey," he said, hesitating like he wasn't sure I'd remember him, but I did. He was the one who'd looked back that first day, the one who'd hesitated before taking pictures of my property. He thanked me, said after that night he'd quit the company, said it didn't sit right with him, being told to intimidate people for money. He'd taken a different job, one that didn't involve following orders blindly. I told him I was proud of that. He smiled, nodded, and drove off. That was the moment I realized something deeper. Maybe justice isn't always about punishment. Maybe sometimes it's about awakening. By the end of the year, Oak Ridge Estates had a new reputation, not as the perfect, polished neighborhood it once claimed to be, but as the one that stood up. Other communities started reaching out, asking how we handled it, how we exposed it, how we took back control. It became something larger than I ever meant it to be. A quiet reminder that even small neighborhoods can be microcosms of power, greed, and resistance. But it also taught me something about myself. For years, after leaving law enforcement, I told myself I was done with conflict, that I'd earned peace, that the world could turn without me needing to intervene. But the truth is, peace isn't something you own. It's something you maintain, actively, constantly. Because the moment you stop paying attention, someone else will try to claim it for you. Months later, I stood at the community entrance, where the old "Security Patrol in Progress" sign used to hang. In its place was a new one, simple and unassuming. Oak Ridge Estate, a community by its residents. I smiled when I saw it, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. No system, no structure, no rule book can guarantee fairness. Only people can. People willing to question, to stand up, to say no when yes feels easier. The HOA will always exist in one form or another. New faces, new rules, new temptations. That's just how communities work. But now, at least here, people know better. They know how quickly order can turn into oppression. They know how silence becomes complicity. And they know that one person, even just one, can shift the balance back toward justice. Every now and then, I still get a letter from the HOA. Nothing sinister anymore, just the usual seasonal updates, landscaping reminders, holiday announcements.
And every time I see the envelope, a small part of me tenses. The old reflex that doesn't fade easily. But then I open it, read it, and realize it's harmless. Still, I keep every single one. Not out of paranoia, out of principle. Because memory is a kind of armor. And forgetting, that's how it all starts again. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I sit on my porch and think about how close we came to losing everything that made this place worth living in. Not the houses, or the lawns, or the mailboxes, but the trust. The sense that your home is your space, not something to be dictated by someone else's idea of perfection. That's what Pierce never understood. You can control rules, you can control money, but you can't control the human need for dignity. That's what undid him in the end. Not paperwork, not legalities, just people. Ordinary, tired, frustrated people who decided they'd had enough. And when people like that stand together, even quietly, there's nothing more powerful. So no, the story didn't end with fireworks or some dramatic courtroom showdown. It ended with slow change. The kind that doesn't make headlines, but lasts longer. Pierce got his punishment. The HOA restructured. The neighborhood found its balance again. And me? I got my peace. Not the kind that comes from quiet streets and trimmed lawns. The kind that comes from knowing that this time, when power came knocking, I didn't look away. Because in the end, that's the real question every community faces. When someone tries to control your peace, will you follow the rule book? Or will you write your own?